When developing software, there are a variety of methodologies that can be followed in order to ensure a quality product is being delivered, and testing plays an important role in each of them. However, depending on which model you're following, the specifics of your testing may change. Now in this video, we'll discuss what software models are, the two main categories of software models, and the components of specific models such as waterfall, agile, and spiral. Now compared to other disciplines like engineering, the building of large software projects is still relatively new. Building houses and even bridges has really been done for ages, while creating software has only really been done since the 1950s. And over this time, methodologies have been created and altered in order to provide us with a structured blueprint for building software applications. And while the number of methodologies is increasing, they still fall into one of two types of models. We have sequential models and we have iterative models. Now, as the name implies, in a sequential model, the various phases in the process are followed in a sequential order, so the next step doesn't begin until the current one finishes. And of course, you have reviews conducted at the end of each phase before moving on to the next one, just to make sure your team is on the right track. And the waterfall methodology is the most common sequential method. Now, sequential models generally start with an analysis phase, and that's where you gather the requirements for your project. Then it moves to a design phase, where the system is being outlined by software architects. Next, we have the development and testing phases, where this can be merged together at times, or they can be separate. But as you begin some parts of your testing, you could still have parts of the system being developed. And the last phase is the deployment phase. And this is where you also install the software and have maintenance done after the software has been shipped. So any minor fixes that have to be sent out or can be applied as needed. Now the second type of model for software development is the iterative model. And with it, there's a high-level view of the system created at the start, but then you begin with a small portion of the entire system and you focus on building that. And with you going through the various phases to get it completed, you can actually progress through the requirements phase, then go into a more detailed analysis and design phase. Then you go into our development and coding phase, which then gives way to testing. And finally, you then release a version of the program for review. So based on that small subset of features that you've done in this iteration, that's what gets deployed. Now for the review, you actually start the cycle all over again. However, this time you may be correcting issues that you found in the previous iteration, along with adding new features. And you just continue to repeat this until the requirements are all completed, and you have a complete product that you can release to your users. Now the major benefit for iterative design models is that if there's a mistake or a misunderstanding done at the requirements or design phase, it should be easier to identify and you can quickly correct it. Mistakes like this when using a sequential methodology would really result in the process backtracking to the analysis phase once again, and you slowly work your way through. So there's much less time spent documenting when you're using an iterative model, but it tries to offset that by being able to develop usable code very quickly. The most recognized sequential development model is the waterfall model, and the diagram shows how the various phases are laid out as a series of steps, or as you can imagine, how the process flows downward with pauses at each level until things are completed, and then they drop down to the next phase. So the first part is our analysis phase, and this is where you do your requirements gathering. You meet with your process experts to get as many details as you can about the current processes and any limitations or exceptions. And then you begin to document what is expected from the system that will be designed. Next up is the design phase, and this is where the components of the system are laid out in order to ensure that the requirements are met. And there's normally no coding performed here. Your system architects will sketch out the parts of the system which are then handed off to your developers. Now at this point you should have plenty of documentation created for your system, and that can be good and bad. But mostly it's supposed to ensure that things are well planned out as you begin the development phase. So the software developers start to write code that matches the design documents. In the testing phase, your tests will be used to make sure that the system is working properly and that it matches the expected outcomes that were identified in the analysis phase. So testing needs to be successfully completed before approval is given to move on to the next phase, which is your deployment. Now, the deployment phase may involve more than just your company's employees. You may have to work in conjunction with clients in order to get your software installed. The system could be installed in a production environment or quite possibly a staging environment, depending on how the sign-off process will occur. Now, once deployed, your application must also be maintained, so regular maintenance of the system as well as bug fixes and improvements would fall into this maintenance area. One of the iterative software development models is the Agile software development process. And this is a relatively new methodology since it first began appearing in 2001, and it still consists of the same or similar phases as our other ones. The major difference is that you do many iterations, so each iteration involves all the stakeholders with plans made to do a subset of features that have been identified. And during the iteration, the team does their planning, their development, testing, and deployment phases for the subset of features with the objective to have a functioning application ready for evaluation. And the evaluation gives all the stakeholders a chance to see how the application is working, and if there's any changes or concerns, they can be voiced at this time. And this type of approach allows feedback to be incorporated right away instead of noticing later on that there are issues. And the next iteration will then add new features to be worked on, as well as fixing any issues that were brought up in the last iteration. Now, the last model we'll look at is the spiral model. And this one combines parts of the waterfall model with parts of an iterative model. And the spiral model was designed for larger projects that have a high amount of risk. So you end up going through 4 phases. There's analysis, evaluation, development, and then planning. And it then continues with these same phases for each new iteration. This model is a great choice when you're trying to minimize or manage any risk. So each iteration builds off the previous one, and the planning stage allows you to see if the risk is worth continuing. So you do end up creating prototypes of the system in each iteration or spiral, and this lets everyone know how the system is progressing. And since you're always analyzing the risks, estimates on how much is left to do and other costs will be more realistic. Now, some of the downfalls or the disadvantages of this method include the creation of a large amount of documentation, which can be tough to manage. And you do need people with a high level of expertise since they're typically larger projects. And the other thing is that it can cost quite a bit to complete this type of project. However, if it's a larger project to begin with, the cost would probably be larger to start off with.